Hello, everybody. We have over 1,400 guests from over 70 countries joining us today for this masterclass talk from the RCA and the Design for Good Academy. Before introducing you to our esteemed guests, please allow me to cover a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded. We'll be able to share a link to the recording after the event. We aim to have an interactive session, and we invite you all to ask questions by using the Q&A. And please use the chat button if you have any technical difficulties regarding the webinar. We will be in the background supporting you. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Don Norman, Sean Carney. I'm going to hand you over to Sean, who is going to start today's conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Lovely to see you, everybody. And great to talk to you again, Don. Welcome. And thanks for getting up early on a lovely California day. So we're going to be talking today about Don's different perspectives on human-centered design and how it's actually started to think beyond human-centered design into more humanity-centered design. So we're going to explore that in a little bit more detail. And perhaps, Don, rather than sort of repeating your resume and who you are, because I'm sure by now everybody in the world knows who you are, let's cut straight into it. So what was it that made you rethink your approach to human-centered design and start to talk about this bigger picture, humanity-centered design?
Yeah. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. It's not a beautiful California day. It's a miserable California today. We're expecting monstrous rainstorms, and there's an emergency alert out by the governor of the state. Yeah, climate change, which is actually relevant to my book. So here's the point. I'm 88 years old. What am I going to do now? I retired for the 5th time. In December of 2020, I started the design lab at the University of California, San Diego. And 7 years after my 5-year appointment, I said, okay, I'm retiring again, but this might be the last one. But what was I going to do? So what am I? People have asked me, what kind of a designer are you? What do you design, et cetera? And I finally decided on the right answer. I'm really an educator. So I design designers. And I'm really most proud of the people who have responded to all my books and to my former students and to the people who send me emails and ask really good questions. So yes, I'm a designer, I'm an educator, and that's what I do. And I've written lots of books about how to make things easier to use and easier to understand. And that's important. But in 2020, as I was resigning for this last time, I said, the world is falling apart. There are all sorts of major issues that are happening. Maybe, making things easier to use is not solving those major issues. What can I do about those? And I looked around and I said, well, gee, the issues are very well explained. There's nothing else I can add to understanding what the issues are. But I also learned much more about what the issues really were, and that concerned me even more about what I was trying to accomplish. Then I looked at the solutions, and lots of people have written books and articles and given talks about the technological solutions. And I said, yeah, those are all wonderful. And then I looked at the United Nations, which has something called the Committee of Parties, a completely nonsensical name. That means that's the Climate Change Committee, and it's been meeting for 28 years. This year was COP28. And what has it resulted? Nothing, almost nothing. Every year they have this wonderful proclamation, and all 194 or whatever it is, nations have to sign it and agree, but no, it doesn't happen. And I realized that the real problem was human behavior, that people are really good at responding to a calamity and trying to help, but they're no good at all about preventing it in the first place. And so that's what I did in the book, is I decided to write about the things where I could present a unique perspective. And I only talked about things where I thought I understood. So there are lots of topics I didn't discuss because I didn't feel I had anything to add. But the main thing I did was I said, look, I have a rule. I tell people in my classes, go out and find examples of bad design, but you're not allowed to present them in class unless you have a better idea. Because quite often when you look at bad design, well, it turns out that maybe it's the best possible design, or maybe it was caused by a lack of communication that one group designed it, another group did installed it, another group did the final touches, and they never talked to each other. In fact, that's one of the major causes of really bad stuff. So that's what I did in the book. But human-centered design is something I've been teaching since the 1980s. And, it's come about through a wide variety of people. In fact, in the early days, from people in the psychology, human factors, and computer science discipline, and then also from the design discipline. But they didn't neither group knew about the existence of the other group. It's kind of amusing in retrospect. But I've been teaching it, and I'm here to tell you that it's wrong. And there's nothing in it that's wrong. So the 4 principles that I like to say are the principles of human-centered design I still stick to. What's wrong is what it does not talk about. And what it does not talk about is how we destroy the environment in finding those wonderful, wonderful materials that make our stuff so lovely and lightweight, etc. We don't talk about how we destroy the environment in the manufacturing and in the fact that we make these things, especially like our new computers and the stuff in the cars, which have hundreds of CPUs, and our mobile phones, we make them small and tiny and lightweight. And so to do that, we've sacrificed a lot of things, like you can barely repair it. It takes experts to repair it. And so when the life cycle is over and they're designed carefully, so their life cycle is meant to be 2 or 3 years, what do you do with them? So lots of countries now just have piles of junk, the electronic junk piled up. India has mountains where they're burning poisonous fumes in the air. They burn because as the batteries deteriorate, they get hot and they cause the fires. Why can't we make things that last a longer time? Why can't we make things that are easier to repair? Why can't we make things that use biodegradable material, don't destroy things when we manufacture it, when we mine for it, and when we discard it? Why can't we go into the circular economy? And the answer is human behavior. So what I talk about is the problems, and I mainly talk about what other people have said and the solutions. And I always find a good solution that other people have done, so that the fact that there's nothing new in that, I think is a good thing, because it means that I'm not just some crazy person spouting off my ideas. But what I do say, let's put it together in a way that works. And humanity-centered design is the term I came across. I found it published about 20 years ago, in fact, by a person who formerly worked for me, to my surprise. And, people ask me why I said we want to do humanity-centered design as opposed to life-centered or people-centered or planet-centered. Well, because I only had one word to choose out of this 3-word phrase, and we all mean the same thing. And I chose humanity, and I've defined humanity to mean anything that impacts life, all life on this planet, and that includes, therefore, the ecological systems of the planet. So humanity-centered design, well, if human-centered design is HCD, I call humanity-centered design H plus CD. It's human-centered plus more. And we have to look at how we destroy cultures with the colonialism, how we actually, when we design for other people, especially societies, do we design for them or do we design with them? And as Sean will tell you in Design for Good, if you design for other cultures, it doesn't work. People waste their money. It just doesn't get accepted. Or maybe they use it for a while and then it breaks and they don't know how to fix it, or it doesn't fit their lifestyles. So we have to design with and by other cultures. And those are the features of humanity-centered design.
Yeah, and we've stumbled on this through the projects we've been working on in Design for Good already. A couple of the teams have already discovered that it's far more productive if we co-create, if we co-design with the people who are actually experiencing the problem. So including indigenous populations, for instance, people who've lived within an ecosystem for thousands of years and have found ways of getting good harvests, for instance, without destroying the soil that they're taking the vegetables from. So that when we talk about inclusive design, that also means working with these indigenous populations going forwards. But there's a lot in that.
Let's go back, because look, our modern buildings are built because we make them attractive and so on, and they're filled with glass and bring in the sun, but they are really horrible in terms of wasting energy. But we rely heavily on the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems to keep it comfortable. If you go look at the indigenous tribes, especially in the Middle East and in India, you'll discover that they used to build buildings that were kept themselves warm in the winter and automatically cool in the summer. And they built it so it was a wind tunnel. The air would automatically rise, can be ventilating and keeping the temperature constant. And we have to go back to that because right now we are really wasting a huge amount of energy because we build such beautiful and horrible ecological buildings.
And it does require then this. We're talking to a population of designers here. We've got 1,400 designers or people interested in design on this call, and it requires us to think differently, doesn't it? I mean, you said before that we have to move on as a profession from unintentionally destructive designs into now being more intentionally constructive. So, for instance, we
That's
talked.
my favorite quote. Yes.
We see. I said I'd find one. We talked last week about electric vehicles. So on the face of it, we feel like we're doing good to the planet because we're getting rid of these internal combustion engines. We're no longer polluting the city around us as we drive electric cars, electric vehicles. But as designers, we have a moral responsibility to also think about how did that car get made? We do think already about where the energy is coming from and the power plants. But what about the lithium mines in Bolivia, where they're completely destructive to the environment and the indigenous population there is struggling because of this huge spike in demand for lithium? These are challenges that I think it now has to become part of our role as designers to think more broadly about the impact of what we're doing.
Speaking broadly, yes, because look, the designer is not going to invent a new kind of battery with new materials, but the designer can actually help in the invention by helping their company try to find it. And people are actually working very hard to find new materials, and there are a whole bunch of ones that are coming out that eventually are going to replace the current batteries. But the designer has to make a point about how the impact of design has been bad for the company, bad for the world. But the real problem, and I want to use Sean as my expert here, the real problem is designers on the whole have no say in what happens in their company. Designers are almost always in the middle levels of a company, and it's rare for a designer to reach the level of chief design officer. And the question is why? And designers often ask me, how come we don't get promoted and engineers get promoted and others get promoted? And I say, well, so how come an engineer got promoted? I mean, because you have to know about business, you have to know about history, and you have to know about politics to be at the chief design level. You have to understand more about the world. You're no longer a designer. You're no longer in your field. You have to think about the company and the country and maybe the world. And they say, well, if they got an MBA degree and they do this and they do that. And I'm saying, yeah, why don't you? And so, Sean, you were a chief design officer of Philips. So tell us about that. How did you get there?
Yeah, again, it's you've always preached empathy as part of it, as a core principle of human-centered design, empathy for your target audiences, for your target users. And one of the things that I always found worked well was empathy for all the business and for the stakeholders.
Yes. Who are your users? I keep asking people, who are your customers? And they say, oh, the people who use the products I design. Your real customer is the boss of your boss, not your boss. Your boss understands you.
And
it's the boss of your boss.
Yeah, and even the CEO has a boss. He has a board, and he has shareholders that he's got to please as well. And this is where the challenge really comes in, isn't it? Because on the one hand, we want to do the right things for our users and for the environment and to be inclusive in all of our design principles. But then the CEO and the board of directors is also trying to please their shareholders. And this is the paradox that we've got to battle with all the time. And I think this is one of the political skills that you need to develop if you're going to come to the top of the ladder and get into the C-suite. How to reconcile the needs of the business and create a sustainable business whilst not destroying the planet and whilst satisfying your core user needs and the principles of your users.
So there's actually, now let's expand that to the current issues, say, of climate change and so on, because okay, so we're burning fossil fuels. We're burning wood, we're burning coal, we're burning oil, and that's destroying the atmosphere. So why don't we change? Everybody understands that in theory. Well, because first of all, we can't change overnight. So meanwhile, so some people say, stop all the burning of coal and fuel and, that. And no, you can't do that because we rely so much on electricity and for energy generator for manufacturing and other things. We can't change overnight. It can take 10 years. In fact, it may only take a year or two to build a new solar farm, but it can take 10 years to get permission to put in the transmission lines to carry the power from where it's generated to where it's needed. So meanwhile, the people doing the using, burning oil and it's coal have to continue. But here's the problem. Those are the people in power today. And the people in power today would like to stay in power. And so they want to keep this going as long as possible because that's their source of their power and their income. Now, how do we change that? And that's the human behavior part, because the problem, it's very hard to tell the people in power they have to completely stop what they're doing. And there are legitimate arguments why they can't stop it immediately, but there are no legitimate arguments for postponing and postponing and postponing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is why we see the energy companies wrestling with, again, the shareholder value creation, at the same time understanding they have to drive the agenda towards more renewable energy sources.
So they call themselves an ecological company, and we're
yes,
yeah, and
change their logos to green, and yeah.
But I discovered that when I was head of research at Apple. It was called the Advanced Technology Group. We would find some people doing, well, you're doing wonderful. That's a wonderful project, but it's not relevant at all to the company. So I'm sorry, we had to shut it down. We want you to do something that makes a difference for the company. And I would come back a week or two later, and I would see yes, they're doing a new project with a new name, et cetera. But it turns out what they did was they simply changed the name and they didn't stop the work. And that's what the oil companies and other companies are doing today. They're changing their name, but not necessarily changing how they behave. But so what can we do to change that? That's the real question. Because we're not here to criticize, we're here to suggest solutions. But I think the solution is, first of all, when you go to a company and say, we're doing things that are bad, you're telling the company the problems. And as an executive, I never like people to come to me and tell me the problems. And it's not that I didn't want to hear about them. I didn't want to be, having them secret, but I wanted to hear the solutions. And so when you come to your company and say, you ought to be doing the circular economy, and everybody will say, but that was going to cost us a lot of money. You have to have a good answer for that. So I want people in the design community to understand business more and how to use spreadsheets more and how to make predictions about expected sales and costs and so on. And also to think about the indigenous community and the cultures of the world, but also make suggestions that are positive, that say how we can accomplish this without the company going bankrupt. Because if a company goes bankrupt, it doesn't do any good anymore. Company has to make a profit to stay in business.
Yeah, I mean, maybe going back to your time at Apple with the advanced development, advanced research team, I mean, I'm sure that team exists in some form or other now, as it does in many companies. But maybe the challenges that we've got to set for these guys now, these really first-class scientists, is to think about how do we achieve all of the parameters that we're looking for from a user perspective. So lightweight, transportable, easy to dismantle, but without creating problems for the environment going forwards as well. I'm sure Apple and other companies like them are doing this work, but
Yes, yes.
are we clear enough in our requirements to these guys as well?
Or from my point of view, are we educating the designers so that they begin to understand more? So does RCA educate enough about engineering, about business, about history, about culture? Now, RCA does have some wonderful partnerships with the engineering school across the street. And that's really an excellent sign. And some wonderful projects have come out of that. But I think we need even more type because we're going to have to, we work with people in marketing. We work with people in engineering. We work with people in manufacturing. We work in the distribution cycle. Uh, we have to have more people listening to the salespeople, but also to the service people. I used to tell my people they had to go in and listen to the service lines I spent a day listening to all the customers complaining because that's where you get your best feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is part of, as we talk conceptually about moving to circular design principles and think about as a service type of product propositions as well, it does mean that the designers have to embrace a deeper understanding of all these business models and think about what it means. So moving a company away from, let's say, transactional sales of a product where, you know, every quarter you're going to see a number of sales and you're going to manage the profitability in that way. Now, if I move to as a service product, where perhaps I'm going to give this product away at the beginning of its life and then charge a recurring fee throughout the life of this product, that's going to hit the short-term profitability and cause a drop in the performance of that company. How do you mitigate for that? Well, we as designers can't do that alone. We need our financial teams to step in and help us model that out. We need engineers to think about how do we create lifetime value for customers. And we need those service engineers on the ground who understand how these products actually work in the field to make sure that we can keep them running as long as possible.
But I also think that what I've been saying now for a number of years, service design, I think, is one of the future directions for design.
Yes.
And when, you know, people ask me, what's the future of design? And they always are thinking about the latest AI that's come out that's going to take away your jobs. No, calm down. This type of new deep learning stuff has only been around publicly for about a year. And so nothing is perfect at the first year. And later on, we'll learn how to use it. And it will change your job, but it'll make your job better. But I also think that it's more traditional fields are also going to become more important, so that service design is going to be one of the secrets, I think, of how to change the business models so they can avoid and move into the circular economy.
Right. And what's interesting for me right now is if we think about service design and we think about service blueprints, look at customer lifetime value, for instance, look at the lifetime of a product. And now with the ability to collect data along the journey so that we can inform our decisions based on data that is being generated during the life cycle of the product. And using data as a creative tool can also be a great opportunity for the future.
But notice what that means for you in the audience who are designers. We're talking about, first of all, making decisions based on data, but what kind of data and about what? It's about the whole chain, the whole system, the supply chain cycle, and for that matter, the distribution cycle and the recycling cycle. And it's things that we never had to think about before and are not being taught in most classrooms today because, well, we've never had to think about it before. But as you move into positions of more responsibility and as you think more about, well, what Victor Papanek said in 1971, he was a famous designer at the time. The first sentence of his book, Design for the Real World, the first sentence was, there is no field more dangerous than design. Actually, he said industrial design, but that's because that was the leading kind of design in those days. So I've deleted the word industrial. He said design. And why? Because of all the stuff we make that destroys the world. And well, then he said, maybe advertising is worse because they're the people who convince the public to buy the crap that designers are building. That's what Papanek said. Well, Papanek was wrong. he was right in principle, but he was wrong because designers can only do what they're asked to do in today's world. So that's why it's so important for designers, not everybody, but a few designers to get promoted up to positions of responsibility. So when a company is deciding what product or service it would offer next, today they seldom would ask the designers. Whereas I think it ought to be the designers who are presenting it to the companies and who are leading in this new change.
But that does require, as you said, the designers to now embrace a broader perspective and be inclusive when it comes to the financial requirements, the production requirements, the end of life requirements, and not get too hung up on just the pure beauty or the craft of the product. So a balanced perspective.
Well, we just redefined the definition of beauty. I'm serious because the notion of beauty changes over time. And so beauty should also be ecologically productive or positive.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I think we've got a lot of questions coming in, Don. So do we want to start looking through some of these? Because I know with 1,500 people on the line.
Design thinking is, well, first of all, it's a complicated question, more complex than it sounds. First of all, what is design thinking? Because designers have always been thinking, right? And designers have their own methods of thinking. And suddenly the folks at IDEO and the D School at Stanford University publicized something called design thinking. And most designers said, that's not what we're talking about. That's a small part. That's the fun part of what we do. Yes, it's true. It's where we do creative things. But design thinking, the real design thinking is much more than that, because we have to, first of all, study the real problems. And we have to understand the core issues that are behind the problems that we're trying to address. The problems are usually the symptoms, and we have to get at the real causes. And second of all, yeah, it's good to have creativity. It's absolutely essential. But, there's nothing the matter with using an old solution. If there's an existing solution, why not use it? You don't always have to invent something new. And finally, what's more important than design thinking is design doing. If you don't actually get it built and having it deployed in the field, then it's worthless. And if you design something with a plan and you hand it over to another group to implement, you're always going to be unhappy with the way they've done it, because you can't do that. You can't separate design plans from the design accomplishments. And so, first of all, there's no difference between what designers should do and the issues we're facing. We just have to broaden the definition. So when you do the design brief, it has to include the circular economy requirements, for example. Or if you're doing something for a societal group, you have to say, who am I doing this for? What members of that group are part of the design team? What have they already tried for themselves? Because usually when there's a societal issue, the people who live there, they understand it. You don't need to send out design researchers to figure out what the problem is. They know what the problems are, and they've usually addressed it already by themselves. But because they have limited resources, they usually address the symptoms and not the underlying issues. They know that that's wrong, but they don't have the ability to go lower. That's where we can put in the work. But also, they need to have some expertise. If you're doing a sewerage system or a clean water system or a new health system, you need experts in those fields. And so designers, I've been arguing, don't have any real expertise because they don't in content matters. But designers are expert in their methods. It's the design methods that can be applied to anything. So the designers could really be the ones in power, basically, because what we have to do is understand the problem, bring in the content matter experts who know about it, help them, and help with the people who are being solved, come up with a solution, and then we have to actually implement it and test it and make sure it's working. And almost invariably, our first ideas are going to fail. And so we have to change the funding people to say, hey, don't make us give a complete plan on day one. Allow us to do these small iterations so we make sure we're doing it right. It's a complex world we're in, but I think designers could lead the way. And that, yeah, design thinking is a part of it, but it's only a small part.
And that's maybe addressing a friend of mine just put up a question here, Jason Messard. How can designers find paths where they can play to their strengths and not try to do everything and run the risk of burning themselves out or even more? And I think you touched on that there. It's sort of pulling in the experts, understanding your own limitations and boundaries.
Yeah, I'm a firm believer in knowing what I'm good at, but more importantly, knowing what I'm bad at. And
Yeah.
so I try to make sure I don't do the things I'm bad at. But when the things that I'm bad at are actually required, well, bring in some people who are good at that. And so, yes, we have to, everything that's important is done by a team. It's not done by a single individual. So one of the things we have to train in our design education is how to work with people from other disciplines. I don't mean how an industrial designer should work with a graphic designer. I mean how an industrial designer should work with, I don't know, the marketing people, the financial people, the sales people, the customers.
Yeah. There's a few comments coming in about, aren't we putting too much on designers here? Isn't it also the responsibility of marketeers and engineers and the C-suite to also care about these things? Why should it fall just to designers?
Yep, absolutely correct. It shouldn't fall just to designers. But I do believe that design, because design is a set of wonderful methods and powerful methods, designers can be the leaders in doing the actual work.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Joe, do you have any other questions? Because there's hundreds of questions coming in, so it's quite difficult to track if these.
Sure, thank you, Sean. I am basically checking out the ones that we are going through. We have some that have been most voted from the beginning. Can you provide some examples where design has been effectively used to reduce environmental impact and promote sustainability?
That's an important question. And it's a difficult question to answer. I think because some of these issues are fairly new. And so if you want to look at, there are lots of small companies that are starting that do excellent work. And there are some larger companies. There are companies, I like to point out, I use as an example, just the Canon laser printer that I happen to own, because actually laser printers and inkjet printers are really services. In fact, all products are services because they offer something to you. But they're services because where does the profit come from the company? It's not from selling the printer. It's from selling the toner or it's from selling the ink. And so it's a service company. And so what happens though where I have a laser printer, it's not inkjet, it's laser. And so I get these big heavy cartridges that every so often I have to replace. But what happens is if I buy them from Canon, they give me the new one in a box, and they tell me to take the new one out and to take the old one out of the machine and put it into the cardboard box. And so that I can mail it back to them. They even give me a mailing label so I can just paste it over the box, and it doesn't even cost me any money to ship it back. And they say they will use every single component that I've shipped back. They will use some of the parts to make new laser cartridges. They will use some of the parts they'll melt it down and use it for other pieces of equipment. And they'll even use the residue of the powder. It's either becomes fertilizer or useful in making roads and useful in all sorts of construction activity. And so they say there's zero waste. So there's one example, and there are multiple others that are similar. Sean, do you have examples?
In a similar vein, actually, because there are other printer companies available. And obviously, having worked for HP in my past, I was very familiar with that particular scenario. In fact, what we did with HP was make sure that we recovered the inkjet cartridges in order that we could also reclaim the chips and upcycle the plastic. And the recycled plastic became the next generation of DeskJet printers, like the one I've just got behind me here. So that was a way of recapturing the value and upcycling those materials as well. But it was a challenge, and this was a service design challenge to make sure that at end of life that we could recover the ink cartridges. Canon seemed to have a pretty good way of doing that with the much larger, obviously, laser toner cartridge. It's a little bit more difficult to incentivize people to send these smaller inkjet cartridges back. But I'm sure there are many other examples like that.
Thank you both for your answers. The next most upvoted question is, rather than the problem being short-sighted human behavior, isn't the problem really capitalism?
Oh, but that's human behavior. Yes, I won't call it capitalism. I call it the current economic system. Because capitalism in the pure form is actually a pretty good way of doing things, because it uses basically competitive principles to try to improve things for everybody, improve the quality and lower the costs. But that's not how it's played out today. So I think the current economic systems, and by the way, that means the legal systems, because the economists rule the world, and they now rule the courts, especially in the United States, because the economists are wonderful. They have these fantastic mathematical models, and they do the magic. And you can't argue with mathematics, can you? Yeah, but it's garbage in and garbage out. If you have really bad assumptions at the beginning, it doesn't matter how powerful your mathematics are. And one thing that economists do not study and do not understand is people. So they assume people are logical, or they have access to lots of information. They make the best possible decision, which is nonsense. And people are not logical. Logic was invented by mathematicians and philosophers. That's not how people think. And so, yeah, what's happened is the economists have ruled, and what they're always after is better profits and better productivity and better measures of this, that, and the other. They don't give a damn, at least not in their formal work, about quality of life. And what we have to worry about is quality of life. And that's where the economic system could be changed, simply to change some of the measures we use. Now, I've talked about there's a group in Oxford that has done some really wonderful work on new methods of presenting economic data. And that's, I think, critical to how we could succeed if we use different ways. It's the name is, what's the group? Come on, it's I'm 88 years old, and my memory sometimes it sometimes takes 10 minutes to come up with the right answer. But yes, so in the book, come on, Donald. I'm not going to find it in the book. Here we go. No, that's a circular economy. I'm looking, anybody in the audience know the group in Oxford that I like so much? No. Anyway, there are better ways of presenting the information, and I think the current economic systems have failed us, and we have to refine them and change them. But they're all codified in laws all around the world. And lots of groups like the World Bank, which is in theory trying to do good, it follows the inappropriate economic approaches. Now, there's a new kind of economics, which is called behavioral economics, and which kind of annoyed economists, because the first person to get a Nobel Prize in behavioral economics was Herb Simon, who was a psychologist, a computer scientist, a business person, etc. And so the economists said, "Ooh, he's not an economist. What a waste of the Nobel Prize." And then the later one was it was Danny Kahneman who got it, and for the work that he and Amos Tversky had done. And yeah, they were psychologists. How come they got the Nobel Prize in economics? Well, because economics is all about people. And there's a field that's called microeconomics, which is actually basically psychology. In fact, I worked in that because my thesis advisor was a member of that field. And so, yes, finally, because of the Nobel Prize Committee in part, a number of now behavioral economics have won the Nobel Prize in economics, and the economists are changing. And thank goodness, because behavioral economics might allow us to change the laws, because it's the laws that govern our world.
I think was the group in Oxford called INET? INET?
No, no.
No, not that one. Okay, there's a couple of
They have
people.
this wonderful way of they have the donut economics.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
they draw a donut, and what the donut does, it's a donut because they do a circle, and around the outside of the circle, they write down all of the major economical issues you should think about, and they show you what is good and what is bad for a country, for the world, for a country, even for a company or a city. And then the inside, they show all the societal issues that are important, and then they show how well you're doing there. So instead of having a single number like gross domestic product, what they do is, which is horrible. You have one number that's supposed to talk about the entire country. No, they say, oh, you can see this country is really good in education, but it's really weak in healthcare, or it's really weak in this or that, but strong in that. And it allows you to know where to focus your work. It's what the data scientists call a dashboard. It allows you quickly to look at something and see where you should be focusing your attention. And then you dive down deeply into that component, and that will have its own little donut. So you can look at the individual components of that. And so again, there are ways we can use the current economic system, but with a more humanistic approach. So we don't have to throw away capitalism. We have to throw away the way it is implemented today.
But this comes back to designers then, rather than focusing on the singular object or the particular brief that they've got, to make sure they think more expansively about the broader systems, right? So more system thinking. You know, somebody who's just spent the last 12 years working in healthcare design, you know, we were working inside care pathways, inside hospitals, looking at different systems and trying to improve patient outcomes whilst lowering cost, making them more effective. But when you take a bigger, broader view of it, you start to think about, well, why are we also focused on the hospital? What about population health? What about being more inclusive and getting into prevention as well? And I think it's that sort of system, and that led us to do design provocations in terms of thinking about preventative health and health and wellness in the home, and how that would reduce the burden on the hospital system and lower the cost of healthcare whilst improving outcomes. And that's an example of sort of thinking more broadly about the system.
And that's also an example why this podcast is not about me. It's about a conversation with me and Sean, because Sean is just as powerful and important as I am, because I talk about it and I write about it, but Sean has done it.
Yeah, we had Don come and visit us at Philips Design a few years ago, and it was great to show him around the labs and see some of the explorations that we were doing, that the team were doing, really on these positive provocations. And I think to your point, Don, and to answer some of the questions, we weren't getting a brief on many of those topics. That was design looking at the challenges we'd been given and thinking, maybe this isn't the right question that we're answering here. Maybe we've got to find an alternative way of looking at this. And that's where we moved from hospital-centered design to more holistic population health principles, for instance.
So when you designed for a prematurely born patient, you looked at everything, including what it was like to be the newly born infant.
Yes.
So you, instead of having it in a plastic container, you covered it up because at night it's dark. And
Yeah.
And what about the parents of the baby? Well, you should design the hospital room where the parents can sleep there, right next to their baby. And,
yeah, when you're designing monitoring equipment for neonates, for neonatal intensive care units, you tend to just look at the technology. But if you think more holistically about the patient experience, about the parent experience, about the clinicians and caregiver experiences, it leads you into a more holistic solution. And I think that's what we're talking about here with more humanity-centered design, isn't it? That we think more broadly about the topic and about the brief we've been given.
Absolutely. And the reason that some of the other fields are having difficulties, like, well, take engineering. Engineers learn their technology. They're focused on the technology. And the technology is absolutely very important. It's partly the cause of our problems, but it's also partly the solution to our problems. But you can't design technology without understanding people. And that's why designers, when you work in a technological company, you have to be the one that actually shows it, how to make it so it's relevant to people and people's lives. And that's going to be hard, by the way, because engineers think that people should think logically, or they shouldn't be using our stuff, et cetera, et cetera. I know, because I was trained as an engineer, and that's how I used to think. It took me a while to overcome that bias.
But this is again back to one of the magic skills of designers is this empathic approach. I think it was Dorothy Edwards many years ago, 25, 30 years ago, talked about ethnographic no, empathic design. Empathic design. There's actually a Harvard Business paper called that. And again, it's just about observing and thinking. And those technicians, those scientists, the people, the physicists who are doing the breakthrough thinking, they should be allies. They should be our closest friends. We should be pulling them in and including them, because collectively together we can find solutions to any problems if we pull those people together.
But we've got to have the people, we've got to bring those people in. I'm not a fan of empathy in the sense that I often don't even know what I think or how I feel. Somebody else has to tell me. And I've been married to my wife for, I don't know, 50 years, and we don't understand each other completely. We can't, because you can't understand or really get in the head of somebody else. And so, especially when you're now going to work with a different culture, it's very important that the people from that other culture be part of the design team. To understand it from their point of view, because they have a different worldview. And it's very hard for us to go in and understand that worldview, therefore bring it into the design team.
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe just a thing here, bringing it back to part of the earlier discussion, design for good. We've been challenged to come and find solutions to some of society's biggest problems, and that's involved the teams coming together from all around the world and then going into different parts of the world, like maybe southern India or Bangladesh or Indonesia, sub-Saharan Africa, and then adopting the principles we've talked about, co-creating with the indigenous population. But are there any ways in which you can think we should be improving that? Because one of the things we're afraid of, and you and I talked about this before, is we can feel that we think we know best, and then we become guilty of design colonialism. I really love that statement, because we're sitting here in our Western splendor and we come in and say, we know what you need to do. This is the solution. So how do we avoid design colonialism in design for good?
Right. I have pointed that out. That's why reading history was very important, about how the Western powers, mostly from Europe, but I include the United States as well, went around and conquered the world and discovered these new uninhabited countries and land, et cetera. They were inhabited, but we called them savages, so we didn't have to think of them as people. Or when Great Britain went to India and said, oh, you guys don't know how to govern yourselves, so we'll help you. We'll govern the country for you. No. When I tell that story to my Indian friends, they're not happy with the result. But designers are colonialists in the sense that we send out the design researchers to look at some foreign country and come back and tell us what the issues are. And then we do our design thinking exercises, and we bring in the experts and say, here's your solution. And we go back and give it to them. That's us trying to tell them what's good for them. And it doesn't work. And it's not that our ideas are wrong. It's that we don't understand their culture and their capabilities and the way they live. And that's why we have to not be colonialists, but we have to be supporters. We have to help them, and we're going to be mentors, and maybe we can supply more resources and some expertise when they need it. Now, there's a really good book that I've been reading and recommending by a woman named Anne Mai Chang. And the book is called Lean Impact: How to Innovate for Radically Greater Social Good. And what she's argued, she's taken the best methods from Silicon Valley about lean startups, in which you start small with a minimum viable product. You do a small test quickly and you modify it, another test, and you modify, and you slowly, incrementally bring up until you're able to do something at scale. And what she points out is that's very difficult to do in the world because the funders, they want to be very careful. They don't want to waste their money. And so they require you to put in a complete plan beforehand. And the whole philosophy of the League of the Agile Lean Startup is we don't know the plan. We don't know what's going to work. And she says it's interesting. If you look at funders of social good, they want the answer right away. And if you look at funders of startups, nah, they know you don't know what you're doing. They look at the quality of the people and they fund the people because they know that probably your original ideas are completely wrong, but they're counting on you to recognize that quickly and to modify them. And by starting small, you're always being agile. It's easy to change. You try to do it all at once, you're stuck. It's a 10-year project, and 2 years in, you realize it's the wrong direction. You can't change. So there are ways that we can do this, and there are a number of good people writing about it, or if you like, actually doing it. I just met with the Aga Khan Foundation in Geneva, and they're doing the same kind of work, wonderful work, mostly in Asia and in Africa. So people like in the United Kingdom or people in the United States probably never heard of them, but they're doing exactly the kind of work that we need to do. And I'm hoping I can form a partnership with the Aga Khan Foundation, with Design for Good, and with other groups that are actually trying to do good in the world.
That would be fantastic. Yeah, we'll definitely be following up on that, Don. But no, I think what we've just been discussing. On the one hand, I've seen comments here that isn't there a danger that as we try to be too inclusive, as we pull in the indigenous populations, we pull in all the disciplines, we pull in engineers and marketeers, and we get everybody involved, that it becomes very difficult to get a winning design out of that. That you can be, you end up designing by committee if we're not careful here. How do we avoid that?
Well, first of all design is designed by committee. Even today, even in a company, you don't have a single discipline involved. And not only that, but you have to pass when you have your ideas, you have to go up the scale and get it approved by higher and higher management who give you suggestions or requirements. So all design is a committee. And yes, when you're doing work out in the field, it's very difficult. And you got to work with the community. Wonderful. We meet with the community and we finally reach agreement and we go off, we do a little bit of work and we come back to talk to the community, and different people show up and they have different ideas. And so you have to learn to do that. And so you need very different skills in doing social mediation, but it can work. It has worked in the past. It really can work. Go to any town hall meeting where the people in the local community are trying to vote on who knows what, street repairs or school systems or the new taxes. You'll find the same kind of fights and disagreements, but eventually you find a solution and you move on.
Yeah, I think that's a challenge, isn't it? Always. When I was in California with HP, we had a principle of we want to be as inclusive as possible in the creation of a concept, but at the end of the day, it cannot be entirely democratic when it comes to the final selection. And finding the right balance there was always a bit of a challenge.
Or as Winston Churchill said, democracy is the world's worst form of government, except for all the others.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the problem with democracy is some people really are more expert at issues than others. But in a democracy, if you really give everybody an equal voice, well, the 2 or 3 experts who really know what they're talking about are drowned out by the people who don't know. But the people who don't know are often, they're concerned because almost any time you do something that's good for a population, you're doing harm for other people. Mm-hmm. And it's the other people who become very vocal and can stop you from making progress. And so, but their concerns are legitimate. And it's really important that we address those concerns and figure out ways in which we can help them so that we're not just destroying their lives. We're putting a power line across the country, which means we have to destroy homes and properties and so on. And that's good for the country, but bad for the people who are being destroyed. And so we have to take that seriously and do something.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we've only got a couple of minutes left, but I just wanted to leave with this one. So there's a nice question just come in. We cannot change the past, but we can transform the future. How do we manage that transition, specifically when so much damage has been done in the past? Let's try and be optimistic about our role.
I am an optimist, and I think, but we're always inventing the future. That's what we do as designers. We invent things that go on and change. The reason the design is not the same as art is because designers are actually creating things. Art is very important, is making social statements and adding to the beauty or depth of understanding of issues, but it's not design. Design is doing things for other people, and we could do that. And lots of things have changed in the last 20 years in the world. A lot of values have changed. A lot of opinions have changed. So that nobody would have recognized that it was possible at the time. So we can change things. And there's two things about the climate crisis. The bad news about the climate crisis is that it's here and it's causing great damage: fires, windstorms, drought, floods, hunger. The good thing about climate change is that it's here and it's causing great damage, like winds and hunger and drought and floods. And that means people are taking it seriously. Because before an event happens, people don't take it seriously. Once it happens, they will. So actually, I think we are in a better position than ever before to actually do things in a positive way across the world. So I'm an optimist.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, Don. And thank you for all the questions. We'll do our very best to take a quick look through all the questions and come back with some answers on them as well. But with that, I think we're at the top of the hour. Thank you.
I would like to thank everyone that could join us today for this lovely talk. Don and Sean, thank you very, very much for sharing your insights and expertise. And I would like to thank the RCA and the Design for Good Academy for hosting this series of the free masterclass talks. The next talk is scheduled for the 5th of March with Daniel Christian Wall. For everyone that joined today, we will share a link to the recording of the session later on our website. Thank you very much for your time and have a wonderful rest of your day. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.